Welcome to Lady Mythos. There was a time when a king was ready to burn a city, not for war, not for power, but because two people fell in love. A love so dangerous that it threatened bloodlines, angered kings, and awakened a prophecy no one was ready to face. And the strangest part? This wasn't the story of a hero. This was the story that made him possible. Because long before Rostam faced demons, before the 7 trials, before the tragedy of father and son, there was a night, a tower, and a choice that almost erased him from history before he was even born. If they had been discovered that night, she would have been executed before sunrise. So the question is, how did a love that should have been punished survive a world that wanted it gone and become the beginning of Persia's greatest legend? Before we step into it, find a place where you can slow down for a while. You can close your eyes and let the story form on its own, or stay with the images and watch it unfold piece by piece. If you've already walked through the trials of Rostam here, then you already know what he becomes. But tonight, we're going back to a time before all of it. And maybe this story will feel familiar in a way you didn't expect. Wanting something you were never supposed to want. Being told no before anyone even understood why. And if you're listening from somewhere in the world, tell me where you are. I always look for those. And if these stories stay with you, you can like or subscribe so the next one finds you when it's time. Now we begin. Before the legend, before the battles, with a boy who was never meant to survive. Chapter 1. Zal, the child of the mountains. Long before anyone spoke the name Zal with respect, it was spoken with fear. He was born different. White hair from the moment he opened his eyes. Not the kind that comes with age, but something unnatural. Something that made even warriors hesitate. His father Sam was not a weak man. He had faced enemies without flinching, commanded armies, stood before kings. But this was something he did not understand. And in a world where signs and omens meant everything, fear won. So the child was taken, carried far from the warmth of the palace, and left in the mountains to disappear into silence. That should have been the end of him. But it wasn't, because something ancient, something watching from above the world of men, found him. The great Simurgh, a creature older than kingdoms, older than the stories themselves. She did not see a curse. She saw a child. And instead of letting him die, she carried him into the mountains and raised him as her own. If you've already heard the story of Rostam's trials, then you know what Zal becomes and how he returns from those mountains. That part of his life, the abandonment, the return, the bond with the Simurgh, is a story of its own. But that's not the story we're here for. Because even after he returned, even after he was accepted, Zal was never truly like the others. There was always something about him, something that didn't quite belong to the world of men. And maybe that's why, when he finally fell in love, it wasn't with someone he was supposed to love. It was with the daughter of a man his world considered an enemy. A princess from a bloodline that should have made their meeting impossible. And yet, somewhere beyond the borders of his father's land, he had already begun to reach him. And the moment he heard it, everything started to change. Chapter 2. Rudabeh, the forbidden princess of Kabul. Far from the mountains where Zal had once been left behind, there was a city filled with light, music, and guarded walls. Kabul, a place of wealth, of beauty, and of quiet tension that never really disappeared. Because this wasn't just another kingdom. To some, it was admired. To others, it was dangerous. And at the center of it stood a king, Mehrab. He ruled with confidence, with power, and with a lineage that made other rulers uneasy. Not because he was weak, but because of where his blood came from. It traced back to Zahak, a name people didn't say lightly, a ruler remembered not for greatness, but for darkness, cruelty, madness, a reign that had left scars across generations. And even though years had passed, even though kingdoms had changed, that name never fully lost its weight. It followed his descendants, like something that refused to fade. So no matter how strong Mehrab's court looked from the outside, there was always a line drawn around it. Unspoken, but understood. People could trade with him, speak with him, but becoming part of his bloodline? That was something else entirely. And yet, inside those walls, there was someone who had nothing to do with that darkness. Someone who didn't carry fear, but curiosity. Someone whose name would soon travel far beyond those guarded gates. Rudabeh. She wasn't hidden away, but she was protected. Raised in a world of silk halls, quiet gardens, and watchful eyes that never strayed too far. But protection doesn't mean stillness, and Rudabeh was anything but still. She listened. To stories, to travelers, to the conversations that slipped past when people thought no one was paying attention. And slowly, piece by piece, the world beyond Kabul started to take shape in her mind. Names, battles, heroes. And one name began to return more than the others. Zal. At first, it was just a story. A strange one. A man with white hair. A warrior raised by something not quite human. Someone who didn't fit into the world the way others did. Some laughed at it. Others didn't believe it. But the stories kept coming. And each time, they sounded a little different. Stronger. More real. One evening, her father returned from court and spoke of him again. Not as a rumor this time, as someone he had seen. He spoke of his presence, his confidence, strength. And then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned the white hair, as if that was the only flaw worth noting. That should have been enough to dismiss him. In a world where signs mattered, that alone could turn people away. But something about it did the opposite. it stayed with her. Not the flaw, but the contrast. A man who shouldn't belong, but somehow did. That night, Rudabeh didn't forget his name. She held on to it, turned it over in her mind, again and again. Zal. And without ever seeing him, without ever hearing his voice, she felt something shift. Not suddenly, not all at once, but enough to notice. The next day, she asked questions. Quiet ones, careful ones. Her attendants noticed. They exchanged looks, hesitated, and then told her what they knew. More stories, more details. Enough to build an image, but not enough to make it real. And that was the problem, because now she wanted to see him, not as a story, not as a rumor, but as a person standing in front of her. The women around her tried to stop it early. They reminded her where he came from, who his people were, what it would mean. Not just for her, but for everyone. Because this wasn't simple. This wasn't harmless curiosity. This was the kind of interest that could turn into something far more dangerous. But Rudabeh didn't step back. If anything, that made it clearer. Because the more they warned her, the more real it felt. And somewhere far away, Zal was hearing her name too. Two people in two different worlds, both held back by things they didn't choose. Bloodlines, expectations, old fears that never really disappeared. And without ever meeting, without even knowing if the other felt the same, they were already moving towards something that should have never been allowed to happen. Because this wasn't just distance. It wasn't just politics. It was history. And history doesn't forgive easily. But none of that stopped what came next. Because soon, they wouldn't be listening to stories anymore. They would start sending them. And somehow, against everything that should have kept them apart, she was about to fall in love with the one man she was never meant to meet. Chapter 3. They fell in love without ever meeting. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment, no sudden decision where everything changed. It started small. A name mentioned more often than it should be. A story repeated one extra time. A detail that stayed in the mind longer than expected. For Zal, it began in a place far from Kabul. He had already returned from the mountains, already proven himself, already stepped into the life people once thought he would never have. But even then, there was always a distance between him and the world around him. Not obvious, not something anyone could point to directly, just something slightly out of place. Then one day, in the middle of conversation, a courtier spoke of a woman. Not in a careless way, not like passing talk, but with intention. Describing her beauty, her presence, the way people spoke of her when she wasn't in the room. Rudabeh. At first, Zal listened the way anyone would, with mild interest, nothing more. But the description didn't stop. It became more detailed. Her hair, her voice, the way her presence seemed to change the room around her. And something about it stayed. Not just the beauty, but the feeling behind the words. That night, he didn't sleep the same. It wasn't restlessness. It wasn't distraction. It was focus. The kind that doesn't go away. The next day, he asked about her again. Not directly, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough. And once that started, it didn't stop. Far away, inside the walls of Kabul, the same thing was happening, just from the other side. Rudabeh didn't need stories anymore. She asked for them, found reasons to hear more, let conversations drift in that direction, and listened carefully when they did. Her attendants noticed. Of course they did. Nothing like this goes unseen. At first, they answered carefully, short responses, simple details, hoping it would pass. But it didn't. So eventually, they gave in. And when they spoke of Zal, they didn't hold back. They described his strength, his presence, the way people reacted to him without even realizing it. And yes, they mentioned the white hair. But by then, it didn't matter, because the image had already formed. And once it did, it became difficult to let go. Days passed, then more, and something strange began to happen. And by then, this wasn't curiosity anymore. It was something neither of them could walk away from. They started to feel familiar to each other, without meeting, without speaking, without even knowing if the other was thinking the same way. It didn't make sense, but it didn't need to. Because at some point, it stopped being curiosity and became something else. They began to imagine each other, not just appearance, but presence. How the other might speak, how they might react, what it would feel like to stand in the same space. And the more they imagined, the more real it became. And the more real it felt, the harder it became to accept that they might never meet. Until eventually, it reached a point where distance wasn't enough anymore. But this wasn't a simple world. You couldn't just send the message, not like that. Not between two people from two sides of a divide that deep. So they found another way. It started with the attendants. The same ones who carried stories now carried something else. Intent. Rudabeh's women left the palace under simple excuses, walking through the gardens, moving beyond the usual paths, until they reached places where people from outside the court could be found. And there, they asked questions. Careful ones, listening for the right name, waiting for the right moment. Eventually, they found someone. A servant, connected to Zal's side. At first, it was nothing direct. Just conversation, shared descriptions, a few exchanged words. Enough to confirm one thing. The stories were real. On both sides. And once that was clear, the tone changed. Now it wasn't about learning. It was about sending something back. A message. Not written, not spoken openly, but carried through people who understood exactly how much it mattered. When Zal heard what came back, he didn't hesitate. Not this time. He sent something in return. Respect, interest, and something more that didn't need to be explained. From that moment, it became a rhythm. Messages moving quietly between two worlds that were never meant to connect. Each one building on the last. Each one making the next step easier and more dangerous. Because by now, this wasn't curiosity anymore. They hadn't even seen each other, but they were already willing to risk everything. And that's when the line was crossed. Because once you start sending messages, once you start expecting them, it becomes harder to stop. And sooner or later, words stop being enough. You want proof. You want certainty. You want to know if what you've built in your mind is real. And that only happens one way. So they made a decision. Not quickly, not lightly, but clearly. If the world wouldn't allow them to meet, they would find a way anyway. Because the next step was no longer about stories. It was about seeing each other for the first time. And that was far more dangerous than anything they had done so far. So they did something no one expected. They decided to meet. Chapter 4. The night Rudabeh let down her hair. Night fell slowly over Kabul. The noise of the court faded. Torches dimmed along the palace walls. Guards settled into their watch, expecting nothing unusual. From the outside, everything looked the same. Quiet, controlled, predictable. But inside the palace, nothing felt normal anymore. Rudabeh had already made her decision. There was no turning back now. Not after the messages. Not after the waiting. Not after everything that had built up between them without a single meeting. Tonight, it would finally happen. Her attendants moved carefully around her. No loud voices, no sudden movements. Everything had to feel ordinary, even though it wasn't. They prepared the chamber quietly. Soft fabrics laid across the floor. Lamps placed low, casting a warm, steady glow. Perfume in the air. Just enough to be noticed, not enough to draw attention. This wasn't just preparation. It was control. Because outside that room, one mistake could cost everything. And far below the palace walls, in the shadow of stone and silence, someone was already waiting. Zal. He stood where the light barely reached, close enough to see the structure above him, but hidden enough not to be seen. Every step that brought him here had been deliberate, measured. Because this wasn't just a meeting. This was crossing a line that could never be undone. He looked up. High above, the tower rose into the night. And somewhere within it, she was there. For a moment, everything slowed. The distance between them felt heavier than before. Because now it was real, not imagined, not described. Real. Then, movement. A figure appeared above. Not clearly at first, just a shape against the dim light. And then, she stepped closer. For the first time, they saw each other. No words, no greeting, just stillness. Everything they had imagined, everything they had built in their minds, now had to match what stood in front of them. And somehow, it did. Rudabeh leaned forward slightly, her voice low but steady, not hesitant, not uncertain. She spoke his name, and that was enough. Zal stepped closer to the base of the tower. The distance between them now felt different, shorter but harder, because there was still one problem left. Height. Stone. Walls that were built to keep people out, not bring them in. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. We all know the story of Rapunzel, the girl in the tower, the long golden hair falling like a rope, the prince climbing, hand over hand, toward her. But this is not that story. Because here, love does not take the easiest path. Then Rudabeh made the first choice. She reached up, and slowly, she let her hair fall. It slipped down over the edge of the tower, dark against the pale stone, stretching further and further until it hung between them. An offering, a solution, a risk. And if anyone had been watching, this would have ended right there. Zal looked up at it, then back at her. It would have been easy, quick, but he didn't move. Instead, he shook his head slightly, not in refusal of her, but of the way, because even now, in this moment, he wouldn't use something that could harm her. He stepped closer, gently lifting the dark strands in his hands, and pressed a soft kiss to them. Then he let them fall, reaching for something at his side. A lasso. With one clean motion, he cast it upward. It caught, held, and without hesitation, he began to climb. Every movement was controlled, precise, silent. Below him, darkness. Above him, her. And for the first time, there was no distance left that couldn't be crossed. When he reached the top, he didn't rush forward. They stood there, close now, but still taking in what was real. This wasn't a story anymore. No attendants, no messengers, no distance to soften the moment. Just two people who had built something out of words, now standing face to face. And slowly, that distance disappeared too. They stepped closer, spoke quietly, not in long speeches, not in grand declarations, but in simple words that carried more weight than anything they had sent before. Everything felt immediate now, clear, because staying in the open any longer would have been a death sentence. They moved inside, away from the edge, into the chamber that had been prepared. The air felt different there, warmer, safer, for a moment. They spoke longer, shared what had only been imagined before, what they expected, what they feared, what they knew would come next. Because neither of them believed this would stay hidden forever. Zal didn't pretend it would be easy. He didn't promise safety. He told her the truth. That their families would resist. That kings might interfere. That this could become something far bigger than both of them. And Rudabeh didn't step back. she didn't hesitate. She made her choice clear. Not with doubt, not with questions, but with certainty. No one else. No other path. Just this. Time passed without them noticing. The night moved forward quietly, while everything inside that room shifted. What began as curiosity had become something solid. Something neither of them was willing to lose. But outside those walls, nothing had changed. The guards were still there. The palace still watched. The world beyond still held its rules. And eventually, the night began to fade. A faint light started to rise at the edge of the sky. Morning. The moment they had avoided thinking about was now right in front of them. Because once the sun rose, this wouldn't stay hidden. Not for long. Movements would be noticed. Questions would be asked. Patterns would break. And when that happened, this would no longer be just theirs. Zal moved toward the edge once more. The same path, but now heavier. Rudabeh stood behind him, watching, knowing this wasn't the end, but also knowing everything was about to change. He descended the way he came, silent, controlled. And when his feet touched the ground again, he didn't look back immediately, because something had already shifted. Above him, the tower stood as it always had. But now, it held a secret, one that wouldn't stay hidden. Because by morning, their secret would no longer belong to them. Chapter 5. When Love Becomes a Crime. The next morning did not arrive gently. Not for Rudabeh, not for Zal, not for anyone who would help them. Because a secret inside a palace never stays still. It moves. From one glance, to one servant, to one small mistake. And once it starts moving, it finds the people who were never meant to know. Inside the palace of Kabul, Simurgh began to notice something was wrong. Not because anyone confessed, not at first, but because mothers notice changes before anyone else does. A silence that lasts too long, a face that looks away too quickly, a servant returning with too much fear in her eyes. Rudabeh tried to carry herself as before, but she was no longer the same. Something had happened in that tower. Something real enough to leave a mark without leaving evidence. And Simurgh could feel it. So she watched, quietly, carefully, and soon the shape of the truth began to appear. The attendants knew something. That was the first crack. They had been leaving the palace, speaking to people outside, carrying messages where no messages should go. Simurgh did not panic. That is what makes her dangerous in this part of the story. She didn't shout through the halls. She didn't run to Mehrab. She didn't expose her daughter in front of everyone. She closed the door. Then she began asking questions. At first, the answers were small, confused, avoiding the center of it. But Simurgh kept pressing, and little by little, the secret came apart. Zal. His name entered the room like a blade. The son of Sam, the white-haired hero. the child of the mountains, the man Rudabeh was never supposed to want. Simurgh turned to her daughter, and now there was no servant left to hide behind, no messenger, no story, only the truth. Rudabeh could have denied it. She could have blamed rumor, fear, some mistake made by her attendants, but she didn't. She admitted it, not softly, not with shame. She told her mother what had happened, that she loved Zal, that her heart had already chosen him, that no warning had changed it. And that is where the story becomes more dangerous. Because until this moment, love had been hidden, private, contained inside messages, whispers, and one night beneath a tower. But now, it had a witness. And once love is witnessed in a royal house, it becomes politics. Simurgh understood the danger immediately. She wasn't only thinking as a mother, she was thinking as a queen. She knew what Mehrab would hear, not romance, not devotion, not destiny. He would hear betrayal. Because Zal was not just a man, he belonged to another power, another heroic line, another world. And Rudabeh was not just a daughter. She was the princess of Kabul, the child of a house already watched with suspicion because of its old connection to Zahak. At this point, love wasn't just forbidden, it was punishable. This was no longer about whether two people loved each other, it was about what their love might create. A marriage, an alliance, a child. A bloodline no king could ignore. And when Mehrab learned the truth, the palace changed. His anger did not build slowly. It struck, the way fire catches dry wood. Because in his mind, this had already gone too far to forgive. To him, this was humiliation. His daughter, secretly tied to the son of Sam. His house, exposed. His authority, challenged under his own roof. And beneath all of that was fear. The kind, powerful men often disguise as rage. Because Mehrab knew exactly how the Iranian kings looked at him. He knew the name Zahak still followed his line. He knew one wrong move could give them a reason to turn against Kabul. And now, his daughter had given them that reason. In his fury, Mehrab did not speak like a father. He spoke like a king cornered. And the punishment he imagined was immediate. Rudabeh could die. Not later, not after a trial. Now. And no one in that room had the power to stop it. That is how quickly the story turns. One night ago, this was a secret meeting between lovers. Now, it is a royal crisis with blood close to the floor. Simurgh stepped into the center of it. And this is where she becomes one of the most important people in the entire episode. Because without her, this love story could have ended right here. No wedding, no prophecy fulfilled, no Rostam. Just a daughter killed by fear before history had the chance to change. She did not defend Rudabeh with panic. She did not beg without strategy. She understood Mehrab's anger But she also understood the larger danger. If he killed Rudabeh, he might save his pride for one moment and destroy everything after. Because Sam would not ignore it. Zal would not forget it. And if Iran's king heard that Kabul had spilled blood inside this conflict, the consequences could reach far beyond the palace. Simurgh needed time. That was the first thing. Not victory, not forgiveness. Time. Enough time to keep Rudabeh alive. Enough time to stop Sohrab from acting while his anger was still louder than reason. Because time was the only thing standing between Rudabeh and death. So she spoke carefully. She reminded him that killing their daughter would not erase the problem. It would only make it worse. She reminded him that the matter had already gone beyond the walls of Kabul. And she made him see what he did not want to see. This was not just Rudabeh's secret anymore. It was already moving toward Sam, toward Zal, toward the court of Iran, toward the throne itself. And that was the moment the fear widened, because there was someone even more powerful than Sam, a king whose decision could turn love into war. Manucher. To Manucher, this would not look like a private romance. He would look at the old blood of Zahak. He would look at Zal's heroic line. He would look at the possibility of a child born from both. And he would ask a question far colder than any father's anger. What kind of power could come from this union? That is what makes this story more than a romance. The danger is not only that Zal and Rudabeh might be separated. The danger is that everyone around them might decide separation is not enough. Sohrab feared shame. Sam feared corruption of his line. Manucher feared the future. And Rudabeh stood at the center of all of it. A young woman whose choice had become a threat to kings. Somewhere beyond Kabul, Zal also understood this. He knew his father would have to be told. He knew approval would not come easily. And he knew that what happened next would decide whether the night at the tower became the beginning of a marriage or the proof of a crime. The whole story now balanced on a terrible question. Could love survive once rulers started treating it like danger? Inside Kabul, Simurgh kept her daughter alive with words. Outside Kabul, Zal prepared to face his father, and above them both, the shadow of Manucher's throne grew longer, because the secret had escaped the tower. It had crossed into the world of men, kings, armies, and old hatred. And far away, a king was about to decide whether their love deserved death. Chapter 6. The prophecy that changed everything. News does not travel quietly between kingdoms. Not when it involves bloodlines. Not when it carries the weight of something that could reshape power itself. What began as a hidden meeting in the night had now reached the ears of a king, Manucher. He did not react immediately. That's what made him dangerous. He listened first, to the reports, to the names involved, to the history behind them. Zal, the son of Sam, a warrior already respected, already known. And Rudabeh, the daughter of Mehrab, a princess tied to a lineage that had never fully escaped suspicion. And behind her name, another one lingered. Zahak. Manucher understood what others only reacted to. This was not just a relationship. It was a crossing of two lines that were never meant to meet. One, heroic, the other, shadowed. And when those lines cross, they don't simply disappear. They combine. That is what he feared. Not Zal, not Rudabeh. The result. A child. Because in a world shaped by lineage, a child is never just a child. It is continuation, power, possibility, and in this case, uncertainty. Manucher had seen what came from corrupted bloodlines before. He had seen what rulers like Zahak had done. He had spent years ensuring that kind of darkness would never rise again. And now, he was being asked, without being asked at all, to allow a union that could bring something unpredictable into the world. So he did not answer with emotion. He answered with caution. He called for his astrologers, his wise men, those who read patterns in the sky and meaning in things others could not see. Because if there was any truth beyond fear, they would find it. The court gathered, quiet, focused, the kind of silence that only exists when something important is about to be decided. They studied the signs, the stars, the alignments that spoke of what had not yet happened. Time passed. Not quickly, not in a way that eased tension, and when they finally spoke, everything shifted. They did not bring a warning. They did not describe disaster. They spoke of greatness. They said that from this union would come a child unlike any other. A warrior whose name would not fade. A protector of kingdoms. A force that would stand against chaos itself. A hero. And in that moment, fear changed direction. Because now the question was no longer, will this bring danger? It became, can we afford to stop it? The court reacted in silence. Not disbelief, but wait. Because a prophecy like that does not remove danger. It transforms it. Now, denying the union could mean preventing something the world might need. Allowing it could still carry risk. And Manucher understood both sides. He sat with it, not rushing to accept, not quick to reject, because even if the future held greatness, the present still demanded caution. And that is when something important became clear. The prophecy had not erased the problem, it had only complicated it. Because greatness is not enough. Not for kings, not for power, not for decisions that affect entire kingdoms. Zal still stood at the center of it, and to Manucher, Zal was still a man who needed to be tested. His origins were unusual. His life had not followed the path of others. Raised in the mountains, touched by something beyond the world of men. That alone was enough to raise questions. Could he be trusted? Could he lead? Could he stand not just as a warrior, but as the foundation of a bloodline that might shape the future? Manichair would not rely on prophecy alone. He had seen too much to make that mistake. So the decision did not come yet, not fully. Instead, he allowed the possibility. He did not condemn Zal. He did not order the union to be broken. That he did something far more demanding. He waited. Because if Zal wanted this, if he truly believed in it, then he would have to prove it. Not through words, not through messages carried in secret, but openly, in front of kings, in front of those who would judge him without mercy. And far away, Zal began to understand what was coming. This was no longer about reaching Rudabeh. That part had already happened. Now, it was about earning the right to stay. To stand in front of power and not be dismissed. To face doubt and not break under it. Because even with prophecy on his side, even with the future promising greatness, none of it mattered if he could not prove himself in the present. And that is what made the next step inevitable. Because kings do not accept potential. They accept proof. Or they reject you completely. And Zal was about to be tested in ways that would decide everything. They weren't afraid of Zal. They were afraid of the child he might create. And that fear had not disappeared. It had only changed form. Because prophecy alone wasn't enough. Zal still had to prove he was worthy. Chapter 7. Zal had to earn the right to love her. By the time word reached him, Zal already knew what it meant. This was no longer about secret meetings or quiet promises made in the dark. This was something else entirely. Because if he failed here, he would not only lose Rudabeh, he would lose the right to ever stand beside her again. A test. Not one challenge, but many. And not the kind that could be solved with a single act of strength, because this time, he wasn't trying to defeat an enemy. He was trying to convince the world that his love was not a mistake. The first person he had to face was his own father. Sam. Sam had already heard enough to be uneasy. He knew who Rudabeh was. He knew where she came from. And more importantly, he knew what others would say. A union like this could stain everything he had built. Not because Zal was unworthy, but because the world would question it. At first, Sam did not accept it. He did not reject it completely either, but he resisted. He spoke of consequences, of reputation, of legacy, of dangers that do not show themselves immediately. Zal did not argue in anger. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't push back with pride. Instead, he stood his ground. He spoke clearly about what he felt, about the promise he had made, about the fact that this was not something that would fade with time. He reminded his father of something deeper, that life without legacy means nothing, that a man is remembered through what he builds and who he leaves behind. And slowly, Sam began to see it differently. Not all at once, not in a way that erased his concern, but enough to shift something. Because he remembered something too. The child he once abandoned. The son he had nearly lost because of fear. And now that same son stood in front of him, asking for trust. That mattered. So Sam did not close the door. He stepped back, just enough to let something else decide. The stars, the signs, the same forces that had already spoken once before. When the astrologers confirmed it again, when they repeated what had already been seen, that this union would lead to greatness. Sam's resistance weakened. He didn't just accept the prophecy. He accepted his son. And that changed everything. Because now, Zal would not stand alone. Together, they moved forward, toward the court of Manucher. This was where it mattered most. Not in private, not in family, but in front of power. Manucher did not welcome them with warmth, because from his seat, rejecting Zal would be easier than accepting him. He observed, measured, because even with prophecy, even with Sam's support, he needed proof. So the tests began. Not announced as trials, not framed as challenges, but placed carefully in front of Zal, one after another. Questions first. Not simple ones, not things anyone could answer. These were questions meant to expose weakness, to reveal uncertainty, to test whether Zal understood the world he was stepping into. One wrong answer here would have ended everything. Zal answered without hesitation, not with arrogance, but with clarity. He spoke of loyalty, of responsibility, of what it meant to carry both strength and restraint. The court listened, and something shifted. Then came the second kind of test. Not words, action. Zal was asked to demonstrate what kind of man he truly was, not just in thought, but in presence. And here, there was no doubt. He moved with confidence, with control, the kind that does not need to prove itself loudly, because it is already understood. The court saw it. Not just strength, but discipline. Not just power, but balance. And that mattered more than anything else. Because kings do not look for warriors alone. They look for men who can hold power without being consumed by it. By the time the tests were done, Zal had done something difficult. He had changed perception. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough. Enough that rejection no longer felt certain. Enough that acceptance became possible. And slowly, the resistance began to fade. Not disappear, but soften. Sam stood with him. The court no longer dismissed him. The prophecy still lingered, quietly shaping every thought. and far away, Rudabeh waited. Because none of this meant anything until the final decision was made. All the tests, all the proof, all the patience had led to one moment. A single answer. One that would not just affect 2 people, but entire kingdoms. Because if this union was accepted, it would join 2 worlds that had never trusted each other. And if it was denied, everything that had been built so far would collapse. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to say, only a decision. And everyone understood what it meant. Because now, only one decision remained. And it would either unite kingdoms or destroy them. Chapter 8. The marriage that changed Persia forever. When the decision finally came, it didn't arrive with noise. No sudden celebration, no immediate relief. It came quietly. Manager gave his approval. Not easily, not without thought, but clearly. The union would be allowed. And just like that, everything that once stood in the way began to move aside. Messages were sent, not in secret this time, openly, formally, to Mehrab, to Sam, to the courts that had been watching from a distance. The tone had changed. What was once dangerous was now recognized. What was once hidden was now arranged. And inside Kabul, the palace that had nearly turned into a place of punishment became something else entirely. Preparation. Not quiet, not careful, but grand. Because this was no longer just a marriage. It was a statement. A joining of 2 houses that had every reason to stay apart. And when the day arrived, nothing about it felt small. The halls were filled, light reflected off gold and fabric, music carried through open spaces, voices returned where silence had once lived. Guests gathered from both sides, warriors, nobles, servants who understood they were witnessing something that would be remembered. At the center of it all stood 2 people who had once spoken only through others. Zal and Rudabeh. There were no walls between them now, no distance, no need for secrecy. Everything that had been hidden was now seen. The ceremony followed ancient custom. Words spoken that had been spoken for generations. Promises made. Not in whispers this time, but in the open. And for the first time, no one tried to stop it. Mehrab stood present, not as a man filled with anger, but as a father who had accepted what he once feared. Sam stood beside his son, not uncertain anymore, but proud in a way that came from seeing something difficult finally take shape. And above all of it, the weight of what this meant stayed quiet, but present. Because everyone understood something. This was not just about love. This was about what comes after. The union had been accepted. The conflict had been resolved. The tension between 2 sides had been held together instead of broken apart. For now, there was peace. Celebration followed, not rushed, not brief. Days passed in feasting, in music, in moments that allowed everyone to step away from the danger that had almost ended this before it began. And somewhere within that, Zal and Rudabeh finally had what they had been fighting for. Time. Time without fear, without hiding, without wondering who might find out. Just time together, as it should have been from the beginning. But stories like this don't end with peace. Not really. Because peace, in moments like this, is often only a pause. The world had accepted their love. That part was done. But the reason their love mattered had not appeared yet. The prophecy still waited, quiet, unseen. Because everything that had been risked, everything that had been tested, was leading to something beyond the wedding itself. And neither of them could see it fully yet. Not the weight it would carry, not the danger it would bring, not the trial that would push them further than anything before. Because the story was never just about whether they would be allowed to be together. It was about what their union would create. And that part was only beginning. Because even after everything they had faced, even after kings had agreed and families had accepted, their greatest trial wasn't behind them. It hadn't even begun. Chapter 9. The birth that should have been impossible. For a while, it seemed like the danger had finally passed. The king had approved the marriage, the families had accepted it. The wedding had been celebrated. After everything Zal and Rudabeh had faced, they were finally allowed to live as husband and wife. But the prophecy had not been fulfilled yet. It was still waiting, quietly, inside Rudabeh. When she became pregnant, it should have been a moment of joy. And at first, it was. Because this was the child everyone had spoken about. The child the astrologers had seen in the stars. The child whose existence had changed the minds of kings. But as the months passed, that joy became fear. Rudabeh's body began to change in a way no one expected. His was not an ordinary pregnancy. It was something no one in that palace knew how to survive. The child inside her was huge, too heavy, too powerful, too much for the body that carried him. Her face grew pale, her strength faded. The same woman who had stood firm against fear, who had chosen love even when kings might punish it, now struggled just to survive what that love had created. The danger had changed shape. Before, it came from fathers, from kings, from old bloodlines and political fear. Now it came from within. No army could fight it. No speech could negotiate with it. No royal approval could make it easier. Rudabeh was dying. And this time, there was no king to convince, and no enemy to fight. Zal could not climb a tower. He could not answer riddles. He could not prove himself in a royal court. He could only watch. That is a different kind of terror. The kind that makes even a hero feel useless. If you heard the story of Rostam's 7 trials here before, then you may remember this moment being touched on briefly. the feather. The gift Zal had kept from the Simurgh. But this is where that memory truly matters. Because long before Rudabeh, long before the tower, long before anyone imagined Rostam, Zal had been saved by the great bird of the mountain. And when he left her, she had given him something. A feather. Not as decoration, not as a symbol, as a promise. If the world ever closed around him, if no human answer remained, he was to burn it, and she would come. Now that moment had arrived. Rudabeh lay between life and death. The palace that had once prepared for a wedding now held its breath around a sickbed. Sindocht waited in fear. Mehrab could do nothing. Sam could do nothing. And Zal, who had crossed walls and courts for love, finally reached for the one thing that belonged to a world beyond men. The feather. He lit it, and the smoke rose. Not like ordinary smoke. This was a signal, a call sent upward toward the mountains, toward the ancient place where Zal had once been a child no one wanted. Then the air changed. The story slows here because it has to. Because this is the moment where the old part of Zal's life returns to save the new one. The Simurgh came. Not as rumor, not as memory, but real, vast, ancient, impossible to mistake for anything else, because nothing else left in the human world could save her. The same being who had once carried Zal out of death now came because his wife was slipping toward it. And the Simurgh did not waste time. She understood what no one else could. This child could not be born in the usual way. If they waited, Rudabeh would die. The child might die with her. And all the prophecies, all the tests, all the danger would end in one silent room. So the Simurgh gave instructions, clear, strange, terrifying. Rudabeh had to be made insensible with wine. A skilled hand had to open her side. The child had to be brought out. Then the wound had to be treated with herbs and healed with the power of the feather. For anyone standing there, this would have sounded impossible, maybe even horrifying. But there was no gentler path left. This was the final test of the love story. Not whether Zal and Rudabeh could be together, but whether they could survive what being together had created. The room changed. People moved quickly now. Fear had to become action. There was no space for panic, no space for doubt. Rudabeh was given wine until the pain and terror loosened their grip. The blade was prepared. If this failed, he would lose both of them. And Zal had to trust the impossible. Again. Because that had always been his life. Stoned, then saved by the Simurgh. Rejected, then accepted. Forbidden, then approved. And now, at the edge of losing everything, he had to believe that what came from the mountain could still protect him. The cut was made, the child was brought out. And suddenly, the prophecy had a body. Rostam. Not yet the hero who would face demons. Not yet the warrior of the 7 trials. Not yet the father who would one day meet his son on a battlefield without knowing him. Just a newborn child. But already different. Already enormous. Already carrying the weight of stories that had not happened yet. And Rudabeh lived. That is the part that matters most here. Because this birth could easily have become a tragedy. The love that survived kings could have ended in childbirth. The mother of Persia's greatest hero could have disappeared at the very moment he entered the world. But the Simurgh's instructions saved her. The herbs were placed, the feather was used, the wound healed, and Rudabeh returned from the edge. Think about that for a moment. Everything had led here. The abandoned child in the mountains, the princess behind enemy walls, the messages, the tower, the rage, the prophecy, the tests, the wedding. All of it for this child to breathe. This is why the love story matters. Not because it is pretty, not because it is simple, but because the Shahnameh treats it as the doorway into something much larger. Without Zal and Rudabeh, there is no Rostam, no 7 trials, no great battles, no heartbreaking road that will one day lead to Sohrab. The heroic world people remember begins with this impossible union. And now, the central question finally begins to answer itself. How did a forbidden love become the beginning of Persia's greatest legend? It survived every kind of danger. First shame, then politics, then prophecy, then the body itself. And at the end of all of it, a child was born who should not have survived. A mother lived who should have died. And a father who had once been saved by the Simurgh now watched that same ancient power save his family. For the first time, the fear around their love turned into awe. Because the child everyone had feared had arrived. And he was not a curse. He was the promise. Rostam had entered the world. And with him, the entire future of Persian myth had changed. Epilogue. The love that created Rostam. And this is where the story returns to the place where it began. Not the battlefield, not the trials, not the tragic road that would one day lead Rostam to Sohrab. But before all of that, there was a tower in Kabul. A young woman looking down into the night. A man standing below the walls. And one choice that should have been impossible. Zal and Rudabeh's story feels familiar in some ways. Like Romeo and Juliet, there are families, old tensions, and a love that powerful people try to control. Like Rapunzel, there is a tower, a woman above, and a man trying to reach her. But this story is not the same, because Romeo and Juliet ends with death. Rapunzel is often remembered as escape. Zal and Rudabeh is different. Their love does not destroy the future. it creates one. That is what makes it so powerful. The world looked at them and saw danger. A strange, white-haired hero. A princess from the line of Zahak. A union that kings feared before it even existed. But the thing they feared most became the thing the world needed. From that forbidden love came Rostam, the child who would become Persia's greatest hero. The warrior who would face monsters, kings, demons, and impossible trials. And later, the same hero whose strength would lead him into one of the saddest stories in mythology. But all of that begins here, with his mother and father, with a secret meeting, with a love that refused to disappear just because the world called it dangerous. And maybe that is why this story still works so well today. Because it is not only about ancient kings, it is about people being judged before they are understood. It is about families afraid of difference. It is about love being treated like a threat because it crosses the wrong line. And it is about the possibility that what people fear might become something greater than anyone expects. So when we think of Rostam, we should not only think of the warrior, we should remember the impossible love that made him possible. The tower, the lasso, the frightened court, the prophecy, the feather burning in Zal's hand, and Rudabeh surviving the birth that should have taken her life. Because most love stories are remembered for how they end. This one is remembered for what it created. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this journey into the Shahnameh, leave a like and tell me in the comments which myth you want to hear next. And if you want more long-form mythology told this way, subscribe to Lady Mythos. Until the next story, stay close to the myth. Yours, Lady Mythos.